When you bring up the name Ambrose Bierce in conversation, the response is likely to be he was a misanthrope, or he was a curmudgeon, or bitter Bierce. So, for starters, let's concede that reality and go on to find out what else Ambrose Bierce was. Here's how Wikipedia begins its biography of Bierce. Ambrose Gwinnett Bierce, born June 24, 1842 in Meigs County, Ohio, was an American short story writer, journalist, poet, and Civil War veteran. His book, The Devil's Dictionary, was named one of the 100 greatest masterpieces of American literature by the American Revolution Bicentennial Administration. And his story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, has been described as one of the most famous and frequently anthologized stories in American literature. His book, Tales of Soldiers and Civilians, was named by the Grolier as one of the 100 most influential American books printed before 1900. So Ambrose Bierce was indeed a misanthrope and a curmudgeon, but he was also much more. Let's take a look at what that might be. Ambrose was the 10th of 13 children born to Marcus Aurelius Bierce and Laura Sherwood Bierce. The Bierce siblings shared one thing in common. Their first names all began with the letter A. All 13 of them. Their father barely managed to provide for his brood, farming, keeping a store, serving as a tax assessor. He did, however, create a sizable library that Ambrose made good use of. Later in life, he acknowledged that all I have I own to my father's books. His parents were deeply religious, a devotion that Ambrose rejected right from the start. In his Devil's Dictionary, he defines faith as belief without evidence in what is told by one who speaks without knowledge of things without parallel. Likewise, he was not attracted to the rural life his father had chosen, writing at various times on the malodorous environment of his home. He left the farm at the first opportunity, dropping out of school at age 14 to take a job that was sort of an unofficial stepping stone for American writers at the time. He became a printer's devil. Benjamin Franklin, Walt Whitman, and Mark Twain were among the other notable writers who served this kind of apprenticeship. I've mentioned the Devil's Dictionary 2 times already, and we're going to interrupt the proceedings from time to time to give examples of the definitions Bierce so incisively left us. Alone, adjective, in bad company. Brute, noun, see husband. Mayonnaise, noun. One of the sauces which served the French in place of a state religion. Misfortune, noun. The kind of fortune that never misses. And peace, a noun. In international affairs, a period of cheating between 2 periods of fighting. Still in his teens, Ambrose enrolled in a military academy near Frankfort, Kentucky. The Bierce family boasted a sort of military tradition. His grandfather had been at Valley Forge with George Washington. His uncle, Lucius Verus Bierce, led a militia on an invasion of Windsor, Ontario, on a campaign to topple the Canadian government. The expedition failed miserably, but Lucius became a hero to American jingoists. Shortly after Ambrose enrolled in the Kentucky Military Institute, it burned down. 9 months later came the event that overshadowed the rest of his life, the outbreak of the Civil War. Ambrose enlisted in the 9th Indiana Infantry and participated in its operations in Western Virginia. He He was present at the Battle of Philippi, the first organized land action of the war. At the Battle of Rich Mountain, he made a daring rescue of a badly wounded comrade while under fire. In April 1862, he fought at the Battle of Shiloh, a terrifying experience that became a source for several short stories and a memoir. The battle at Shiloh racked up a death toll greater than that of the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War combined. At Shiloh, Ambrose witnessed terrible carnage and touching comradeship. He saw the staggering din and felt the eerie silence, the battlefields littered with detritus, and the human wreckage left behind. Military promotions kept coming. He was elevated to first sergeant, then to sergeant major, then to second lieutenant, and then to first lieutenant. He served on the staff of General William Hazen as a topographical engineer, basically a map maker, sketching out likely battlefields. As a staff officer, Bierce became known to several leading Union generals. General Hazen and others recommended him for entrance into the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Then in June 1864, Bierce sustained a traumatic brain injury at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. A bullet struck him in the head, leaving it, in his words, quote, broken like a walnut. He spent the rest of the summer on furlough. He returned to active duty in September and was discharged from the Army in January 1865. After leaving the Army, Ambrose took a job with the Treasury Department in Alabama as an agent in charge of confiscated property. He disliked this position with a passion, and when General Hazen offered him work in the summer of 1866, he jumped at the chance. He was given the job of topographical attaché to a four-man exploratory expedition from Omaha to the West Coast. The mission ended in San Francisco that fall. He expected to be rewarded for his exemplary military service with a commission as a captain in the regular army. Instead, the Army offered him a second lieutenancy. He was mightily offended and stayed in San Francisco when Hazen moved on. It's important to note that among all first-rate chroniclers of the Civil War, only Bierce had actual experience in the fighting. Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage, for example, was written some 20 years after the war. Crane had not even been born while the war was in progress. For his part, Mark Twain joined a Confederate militia, the Marion Rangers, at the outbreak of hostilities, but he lasted only 2 weeks before he quit and went west. Bierce learned firsthand the horrors of war. The Devil's Dictionary. History is an account, mostly false, of events, mostly unimportant, which are brought about by rulers, mostly knaves, and soldiers, mostly fools. Whether he was aware of it or not, by the fall of 1866, Ambrose Bierce had become a Westerner. He took a job as a night watchman for the Treasury Department and devoted his spare time to becoming a writer. He admired and learned from the caustic satires of the great English writers, Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift. He began to offer freelance submissions to the many San Francisco newspapers. His caustic style was extremely popular. He eventually took over the Town Crier column in a publication called Newsletter and California Advisor. Bierce embarked upon a wide swath of mischief in the column. He pilloried everyone from rival editors to President Grant, to religious figures, to women, to politicians. Nobody was safe from his rapier-like wit. But it wasn't all bile and belligerence. He had a bad case of asthma, and the San Francisco fog played havoc on his lungs. To get away, he often crossed the bay to Marin County, where he met Mary Ellen Molly Day, the beautiful daughter of a rather wealthy mine owner. Molly's mother was a social climber and didn't approve of her daughter seeing a not-so-successful freelance journalist, which of course made Molly all the more determined to continue her relationship with Ambrose. The couple were married in late December of 1871. 5 months later, they were off to an extended, if belated, honeymoon in England. The trip was a gift from the bride's parents. Bierce immediately set his sights on conquering what he considered to be the most glittering city in the Western world. And for their part, Londoners saw Bierce as a wild Westerner. Bierce demonstrated to the English that he could produce something that American literary roughnecks couldn't. He produced first-rate topical satire. English public publishers brought out 3 of his San Francisco writings in book form, but the books didn't impress Ambrose. He thought of himself as a journalist, not an author. On the other hand, his book royalties paid the bills. While they were in England, Ambrose and Molly became parents, first to a son named Day, then to another son, Lee. Molly and the boys returned to California for a visit in the summer of 1875, leaving Bierce behind to practice his profession. When Molly wrote to him to let him know that she was pregnant again, he decided it was time to go home. His earnings in Britain weren't all that good, and he missed his wife and boys. Back in San Francisco, he got a job as associate editor of a publication called The Argonaut. Bierce also wrote a salty column, Prattle, in which he commented on local news and people. The Argonaut was funded to counteract the influence of labor leader Dennis Kearney, who became Bierce's arch-enemy in the early part of his journalistic career. Kearney was the leader of the Working Man's Party and a union organizer whose mission was to advocate for Caucasian men over the immigrant Chinese who built the railroads and worked for considerably lower wages. After 2 years with the Argonaut, Ambrose left on a mission to strike it rich in the mining business like his father-in-law had. In 1880, he set out for the Black Hills of South Dakota to manage a gold mining operation in Rockerville, Dakota Territory. Unfortunately, the mine turned out to be an underfunded fiasco. Bierce even had trouble collecting his salary. When he was forced to slink back to San Francisco in defeat, his trouble was compounded when the Argonaut's owners refused to rehire him. Then an excellent position turned up as editor of The Wasp, a weekly magazine known for its satire, criticism, and cartoons. At The Wasp, Bierce began taking potshots at the Central Pacific Railroad, an activity that would bloom into a full-blown crusade for him. His sly critiques also attacked every facet of art and science. In reviewing one particular book, he said, "The covers of this book are too far apart." He saved his most savage comments for crooked politicians and amateurish writers. One author referred to him as the public executioner and tormentor. He spent very little time with his family during this period. There were two reasons for the domestic separation. His asthma fared better in the dry air of Central California, but there was also the mother-in-law problem. Mrs. Day was a domineering woman who insisted on micromanaging her children's lives. She practically moved in with the Bierces and continued to be a thorn in Ambrose's side. Even her husband was usually absent from their home in San Francisco, preferring the rough life of his mining camp to domestic life under her roof. Then in 1887, Ambrose Bierce met a gent named William Randolph Hearst, and a relationship of 2 decades was launched. Bierce was now in his mid-40s and living in Oakland when Hearst knocked on the door. "I am from the San Francisco Examiner," Hearst explained. "Oh," Bierce replied to his youthful-looking visitor. "You come from Mr. Hearst?" The youth lifted his blue eyes and cooed, "I am Mr. Hearst." Hearst's father was a precious metals millionaire. He was also a U.S. Senator for the state of California. He'd given his son the Examiner as a gift. The younger Hearst guessed that Bierce's raucous style would help him make a splash in journalism. He was right. Bierce agreed to write for the paper with the understanding that his copy run exactly as written. This stroke of good fortune made Bierce and his family financially secure. It also gave him a platform for the next 2 decades. From time to time, an editor for one of Hearst's papers would cut one of Bierce's more offensive passages, and Ambrose would resign in protest. Hearst would come in to placate his star writer, and then the partnership would proceed as usual. Now that he was responsible for only 2 columns a week, Bierce had the free time to write stories and essays. He imagined that his lasting reputation would rest upon these works. Much of his short fiction was placed in the Examiner and in a magazine called The Wave. The majority of this work was produced in a burst of creativity between 1887 and 1893. His fiction mostly deals with the occult and to surprise endings. His themes were supported by his experience and knowledge of war. Perhaps the best of his short stories, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, involves a condemned Confederate soldier going through his last moments of life in an elaborate escape just before the hangman's rope does its work. The story is regarded as one of the most famous and frequently anthologized stories in American literature. It is an early example of the stream of consciousness narrative style, and it is typical of Bierce's macabre imagination. Death. Having found a subject he could address better than anyone else, he revisited it again and again with spectacular effect. Only a very few writers are so closely associated with a particular phase of human life. Bierce immersed himself in the final and most mysterious phase of life. Ironically, by focusing so intently on death, he earned a measure of immortality. The Devil's Dictionary. War is God's way of teaching Americans geography. Many others were gathered in 2 volumes. The first was Tales of Soldiers and Civilians, and the second was Can Such Things Be? William Dean Howells thought so much of the stories that he placed Bierce, quote, among our 3 greatest writers. Typically for Bierce, he responded to the praise with this: I am sure that Mr. Howells is the other two. For two experiences that must have reinforced his tragic view of life. The first was the end of his marriage, which had been teetering on the rocks for some years. The break was so complete that afterwards he and Molly only spoke to each other on two occasions. The second terrible event was even more traumatic. His oldest son, Day, was intelligent, handsome, and arrogant. In some respects, he was a mirror image of his father. He had a quick temper and an acerbic wit. He was working as a journalist with a paper in Red Bluff, California, when he became engaged to a young woman. The night before their wedding, she ran off and married Day's best man, a fellow named Neil Hubbs. When the couple returned to Red Bluff, Day was waiting. He and Hubbs each drew revolvers and began shooting at each other. Day gave Hubbs a mortal wound, then turned the gun on himself. 2 young lives were snuffed out in moments, and Ambrose, as might be expected, was devastated. It was a low point in his life. He was overtaken by grief and outclassed in his literary pursuits by much younger men like Stephen Crane, who achieved wild success with stories like The Red Badge of Courage. Then he got the opportunity of a newspaperman's lifetime. A telegram came. It was from Hearst. He wanted Bierce to take on a special assignment, go to Washington and do battle with the Southern Pacific Railroad, the Octopus. William Randolph Hearst's opposition to the Southern Pacific Railroad was almost a matter of fate. The Big Four railroad magnates, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Charles Crocker, and Mark Hopkins, had succeeded in putting an iron fist around the entire state of California. They were all Republicans, while Hearst's father, the senator, was a Democrat. For all their wealth, the Hearsts fancied themselves the allies of the working class. San Francisco was an anti-railroad town, and there was plenty of room for anti-monopoly journalism there. A bit of clarification here. The Central Pacific Railroad was chartered by Congress in 1862 to build a railroad eastward from Sacramento to complete the western part of the first transcontinental railroad in the country. This is the railroad that met up with the Union Pacific in Promontory, Utah, where the Golden Spike was driven. The Central Pacific was acquired by the Southern Pacific Railroad in 1885, and from then on operated as a leased line. The issue of the day involved a congressional debate over a funding bill that would cancel the debt of the Western railroads to the federal government for past land grants and loans. Both Bierce and Hearst were up in arms. At this time, politics in the state of California was for all practical purposes controlled entirely by the Southern Pacific. The San Francisco papers had been virtual partners with the railroads until now. They exchanged ad revenue for editorial support. When the news organizations defected, a certain amount of control slipped away from the railroad barons. Bierce found himself in Washington wrestling with the railroad's chief negotiator, Collis Huntington. He worked out a plan of attack based on a steady bombardment of dispatches and editorials printed in the Examiner and its New York sister paper, the Journal. Huntington was in Washington lobbying for the bill by buying votes in Congress. The railroads proposed gradual remission of the $75 million they owed the government by refunding it with long-term, low-interest bonds to mature in 75 years. They banked on the probability that the loans would be forgiven long before that. Huntington underestimated Bierce's power as a journalist, and that's what led to his downfall. After several months of critical columns on the funding bill, Huntington felt the Bierce sting. One of Bierce's stories began, "Mr. Huntington appeared before the committee and took his hands out of all pockets long enough to be sworn." After 6 months of abuse, Huntington broke under Bierce's print crusade and tried to pay off his nemesis on, of all places, the steps of the nation's capital. "Name your price," Huntington said. "Every man has his price." "My price is $75 million, Bierce replied, "to be handed to the Treasurer of the United States." It was Bierce's greatest coup in journalism. He had single-handedly defeated the notorious funding bill. In so doing, he had also made a case for public ownership of the railroads. His rare gifts as an investigative reporter and incorruptible columnist still stand as a model for contemporary journalists. Now, Ambrose Bierce was not the only one to take aim at the railroad's monopolistic practices. A young novelist named Frank Norris had also taken up the banner of opposition to the Southern Pacific with a book titled The Octopus. The story was based on the Muscle Slough tragedy of 1880, which involved a bloody conflict between ranchers and law enforcement agents defending the Southern Pacific. The central issue was over the ownership of the ranches, which the farmers had leased from the railroad nearly 10 years earlier, with intentions of eventually purchasing the land. The original price was $2.50 to $5 per acre. Then the railroad opened the land for sale at prices adjusted for land improvements, leading to the conflict described in The Octopus. The contending forces faced off against each other on May 11, 1880, on a farm located 5.5 miles northwest of Hanford, California, in the San Joaquin Valley. 7 people were killed. The exact history of the incident is murky, largely because popular anti-railroad sentiment in the 1880s interpreted the incident as a clear example of corrupt and cold-blooded corporate greed. In The Octopus, Norris glorified the settlers and used the events as evidence and justification for his anti-corporate crusade. While the Norris book had a powerful influence on public opinion, keep in mind that it was first published in 1901, some years after Bierce's victory in Washington. Now back to Ambrose. After spending a year in Washington, he returned home to California, something of a local hero. He was suffering from a complete physical breakdown brought on by stress. He spent several months trying to regain his health. While recuperating, he received notice that Congress had ordered the Southern Pacific to repay its government loan at 6% interest in 20 installments, one note falling due every 6 months. The railroads, as Bierce called them, would have to pay their debt in 10 years, not the 75 years they'd asked for. With the defeat of the funding bill, Bierce was at the height of his career. As a crusading muckraker as well as an innovative literary genius, his reputation soared. He continued to write his column for Hearst while managing an enormous manuscript reading service for an ever-growing circle of admirers. His reclusive nature made him difficult for admirers to track down, but those who were able to find him at home in Los Gatos Hills were surprised by his earthiness and love of wild animals. His guests would find themselves traipsing through the redwood forests to keep up with a rejuvenated Bierce. Still, his problems with the Hearst organization continued when editors of various Hearst papers cut his copy to fit their needs. This, along with Hearst's growing liberalism, caused more antipathy and resignations. Then in October 1899, a huge forest fire burned everything on a ranch owned by one of his good friends. Suddenly he felt old and out of place. His habit of suffering insults, real and imaginary, took vent in an outbreak of arguments and angry letters to old friends and new admirers. His vulnerable pride caused him to hurt those he once held close. He was capable of discarding friends who showed too much individuality or disagreed with his philosophy. He could not accept the fact that his hold on the title of Dean of West Coast Literature was slipping. For some time, he'd had offers to join the staff of the New York Journal. Now he abruptly accepted the offer, on condition that he live in Washington and continue to write his syndicated column. He had burned his bridges in California and was ready for a change in scenery. By December, he was on a train heading east. Bierce arrived back in Washington in January of 1900. Much to everyone's surprise, he lived and worked there for the next 10 years. During that time, the country saw the miracle of the first flight at Kitty Hawk, Peary's conquest of the North Pole, automobiles racing down city streets, and motion pictures. But for Ambrose Bierce, the period marked the end of a career in literature. At age 58, he decided to give up literature and devoted himself to journalism. More specifically, he became a watchdog over Congress and politicians. Then another personal tragedy. His second son, Lee, lost touch with reality between obsessions with drink and with women of questionable character. Lee was a respected journalist who has significant experience with the Los Angeles Record and the New York Post. After a monumental spree during the holiday season, he came down with pneumonia. He was delivering food to the needy in the spirit of Christmas, but became so potted on his route that he gave away most of the donations before he reached his destination. The episode resulted in severe exposure, which in turn led to his death. 4 years later, Bierce's estranged wife, Molly, died of heart failure in Los Angeles, where she'd been living with her mother for several years. Ironically, she'd filed for divorce just a few months before her death. Ambrose was devastated by the deaths of his son and his wife. His essential belief that nothing matters came crashing down on him. The Devil's Dictionary. Egotism, doing the New York Times crossword puzzle with a pen. To make matters even worse, his relations with Hearst had become more strained than ever. He finally quit all newspaper work and devoted his time to a column called The Passing Show for Cosmopolitan, which was a Hearst magazine. As far as Hearst himself was concerned, Bierce half-joked that his ambition in life was to outlive Hearst for the supreme pleasure of howling over his grave. Then in 1908, a publisher offered to bring out a 12-volume set of Bierce's collected works that Ambrose himself would edit. The prospect of leaving a permanent monument to his journalistic and literary work thrilled the old curmudgeon. The project turned out to be so gigantic that he was forced to break off all relations with Hearst in order to stay on schedule. The added pressure made him even more antisocial and suspicious. After 10 years, Bierce was tired of life in Washington. He began thinking of returning to California. The drudgery of pasting up copy for his collected works convinced him that he needed a change in scenery. He set out once more for the Golden State. In San Francisco, he was greeted like a prodigal son. He kept busy making the rounds of various dinners in his honor. The homecoming was both enjoyable and vaguely depressing. His cadre of followers was largely gone, as was his long-held literary authority in the West. But then he was visited by his most famous pupil, one George Sterling. Sterling was a prominent poet and playwright with residence in both San Francisco and Carmel by the Sea. The two reestablished their connection. Sterling invited Bierce to his artist colony in Carmel to meet some of the new literary lights in the area. Bierce characterized the community as, quote, little more than a nest of anarchists, posing as writers and artists. When he learned that writers Jack London and Upton Sinclair were frequent visitors to the colony, he called the place, quote, home of cranks and curios. George Sterling finagled to arrange a meeting between Bierce and London. Sterling was an admirer of both men. London was in a foul mood at the time. He had just lost a great deal of money when Jack Johnson knocked out Jim Jeffries in a heavyweight title fight in Reno. Damn Ambrose Bierce, he said. If he jumps me, I'll go him a few at his own game. When the two men met at the Bohemian Club in August 1910, Sterling realized that he may have made a mistake. All hell might break out when the two short-tempered prima donnas met. Sterling pleaded with Bierce to avoid Jack London. A huge crowd gathered to witness what might be the culmination of two opposing points of view, London the socialist and Bierce the conservative. The crowd was probably disappointed to see Bierce hold out a hand for a handshake and London take it with a smile on his face. Bierce had learned that Jack and his wife, Charmian, had lost their first child just days earlier. Having lost two children of his own, Ambrose was undoubtedly sensitive to the subject. Politics aside, the two writers proceeded to get so blitzed that Sterling had to come to their aid. He moved them to a nearby campsite where they sat around a roaring fire, drinking and philosophizing until none of them knew what the heck they were talking about. Bierce left California for the last time in October 1912. He spent the following year in Washington defending his collected works, which was not well received by critics. By 1913, at age 71, he was pretty much a physical wreck from combined effects of asthma and alcohol. After months of depression, he announced that he was going to travel south to observe the Mexican Revolution. The Devil's Dictionary. Patience, noun, a minor form of despair disguised as a virtue. He wrote a number of ominous farewell letters, including one that contained the following warning. If you should hear of my being stood up against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, please know that I think it is a pretty good way to depart this life. It beats old age, disease, or falling down the cellar stairs. To be a gringo in Mexico, that is euthanasia. Departing Washington, he stopped along the way to visit the Civil War battlefields of his youth. By the end of the month, he had reached New Orleans, where he was laid up for several days with asthma. When a reporter asked why a man of his age would undertake such a dangerous journey, he said, "I like the game. I like the fighting. I want to see it." Pushing on to Texas, he reached San Antonio on October 27, 1913. He was received at Fort Sam Houston as like a foreign ambassador. On November 6th, he reached the border at Laredo. His plan to cross the border and join the forces of Pancho Villa in his rebellion against the government of General Huerta was postponed once again by an attack of asthma. His next stop was El Paso. From there, he crossed the border into Juarez. He somehow received credentials as an observer attached to Pancho Villa's army. Then he traveled to Chihuahua on horseback and wrote his last letter to his secretary. He said, "Trainload of troops leaving Chihuahua every day. Expect to go to Oaxaca tomorrow, partly by rail." These were the last words ever heard from Ambrose Bierce. By creating his own mysterious exit, he swung the door open for a host of theories, both logical and crackpot, as how, where, and when he met his end. Bierce's unexplained disappearance stands as one of the great vanishing acts of the modern world. There were years of Secret Service investigations, Pinkerton searches, official U.S. Army inquiries, and even consultations with mediums who said they communicated with spirits. After his presumed death, people who had never read a word of his journalism or fiction were suddenly intrigued with his fate. Those who expected an answer were destined to disappointment. What's left to us is his legacy. It may be difficult to appreciate just how shocking and revolutionary Bierce's message was to genteel readers of a more innocent time. In his stories, Bierce never cries. He rarely even blinks. He looks at the most horrific sights with a flat perception that is almost neutral. He leaves behind a body of work that many considered to be scathing, but all would agree was brutally honest.